What's up guys, and welcome back to, I guess, what is technically a Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon speculation video, except we're not talking about the games specifically today. We are going to be talking about the game series as a whole. So I wanted to take a short time just to go over Generation 7 and 8, I suppose we're talking about here, before I dive sort of really deep into just video after video of different things we could see in the games, and talk about the games in general and what they might mean for, the coming years. So obviously, when we heard the rumours of Pokemon Stars, or the impeding upcoming Diamond and Pearl remakes, which of course aren't confirmed, but it's what we're expecting. When we heard about Stars particularly, we thought, oh great, a third version, and we'll get into Necrozma sort of, well, we didn't necessarily think that, but it was one of the possibilities. A third version focusing on Necrozma, and then we could have Diamond and Pearl remakes right afterwards. Instead, of course, what we got here was a double third version, basically, an update. And of course that is very similar to something we have seen happen in the past with Pokemon Black 2 and White 2. We had Pokemon Black and White, and after that people were expecting Pokemon Grey, and then something else we were talking about on the cards as well was a possible, Auras, or Ruby and Sapphire remake at the time, which of course we didn't get. We got Black 2 and White 2 as follow-ups to Black and White, and then that was it for Generation 5. And then we came on to Generation 6, of course. That did include the Ruby and Sapphire remakes, and we go on from there. So it looks like they might be repeating this pattern again so Generation 4 we'll start with, was a, double game, third version, possible third version, you always have to have that. Third, new game, new generation, new double games, and then double remake, obviously with Ruby and, Heart Gold and Soul Silver at that point. Then we went Gen 5 and we just had double game, double sequel, I'll call it, sequel or update as it will be for Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. And then we had Generation 6 where we had new generation, new double game there, and then we had a remake with Auras. We were also possibly expecting a Z, but that's gone to the wayside again, so it looks like they might be ditching third versions altogether, which isn't too surprising because of course a third version release, or remake, or release I suppose it is really, is good, it generates some money. However, if they release two games instead of just a single one, a lot of people will buy both games so they get more money, so why not? So it looks like they might be ditching a third game altogether and going for either, as they are for Black 2 and White 2, a sequel, proper sequel there, or just as it seems to be for Sun and Moon, an update, which of course takes less work, and they can release two games for that. So it looks like they're ditching that altogether, but Generation 5 with the sequels, then Generation 6 for X and Y and Auras, and then on to Generation 7, which looks like it might just be Sun and Moon, and then Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and that might be it for this generation. They could sneak in the remakes at the end, but I think it would be really weird for you to have 6 games in one generation, 6 main series games. I don't think we've ever had that before. The closest we'd come to that would be, Generation 1, we had Red and Blue, or Red and Green in Japan, also then Blue in America, Yellow, but there's only 4 games. Obviously it wasn't a big generation. The closest you get would be Generation 4 with Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, Heart Gold and Soul Silver at 5, but 6 is even more. So the question is why? Why are they doing this? Why are they not, obviously the remake games are pretty damn popular. Auras was a decent hit, I will say, not an amazing hit, but people still bought it because of the hype and the nostalgia. Same thing with Heart Gold, Soul Silver. So why not throw out a Diamond and Pearl remake right now to get the hype of Generation 4 and keep it running, because I sure as hell would love to see a remake of those games. Well, it might be just to do with timeline, okay? So I did a little look into the release dates of the games, of the actual new generation game, and then any remakes, and I sort of tracked it along. So Generation 1 came out in 1996. I'm going to work off Japan dates for the most part here, because obviously that's when the games were properly finished, I suppose. 1996, Japan released Generation 1. Generation 2 came out in 1999. Of course, it's a very quick turnaround, or I guess you could say a medium turnaround, because the games were new, so they're sort of chugging it along slowly, but also, there were no extra games in Generation 1 apart from obviously Red, Blue, Green, etc., and possibly Yellow you could sneak in there. Generation 3 with Ruby and Sapphire then came along in 2002, and then of course in that generation there we also got Fire Red and Leaf Green, and those games came out in 2004, 2 years later. Then Generation 4 popped up, and that was released in Japan in 2006, obviously 2007 for the rest of the world. And in Generation 4, after Platinum, we had obviously in an intermediate year, we then had the remakes of Gold and Silver, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and those were released in 2009, so 3 years rather than just the 2, because of that Platinum game, which I assume came out like 2008 time, which obviously took up a bit of time. You couldn't throw all the remakes out straight away. Then we had Generation 5 in 2010. Following that, we had Generation 6 in 2013, Generation 7, Generation 6 in 2013, the remakes, of course, Auras, 2015 I'm guessing it was, and then of course 2016 we have Generation 7 for Sun and Moon, and then it looks like the second half of Generation 7, 2017 will be. So why did they suddenly drop these sequels? Well, if we track back, and I imagine they continued doing sequels every generation and fill in some gaps here. So let's have a look and let's say, okay, well, Generation 5, let's assume they do like a grey version, or maybe just black 2 and white 2 again, and then do some sequels. So imagine maybe it came out in 2013, maybe, possibly, it depends obviously what the setup would have been with black 2 and white 2, but seeing as Generation 6 came out in 2013, 2012 maybe is a good estimate there for when a Ruby and Sapphire remake in Generation 5 would have been released. So that leads on to Generation 6 in 2013 still, or maybe 2014 on the 3DS, and then we have Generation 4 remakes as part of Generation 6, as opposed to Generation 3 remakes, which we had because obviously we're moving to Gen forward here. So that might come out in at the same time as Auras did, so 2015 time, and we'd have it then. And then moving on further to Generation 7, this cycle, I suppose. Say we got Downpour remakes either this year or next year, because of course you might have a Stars version, for example, is what I'm speculating on there if they went that road. So possibly in 2017 or 2018, possibly the more likely one there. So then leading on further, you could do Generation 6. Again, because obviously at this point you get Ruby and Sapphire remakes in Gen 5, Downpour remakes in Generation 6, and you'd be having a Nova remakes right now in this generation, so in a year or two. And I do not think we need a remake of Black and White, because they were only 7 years ago, and they're still on the DS, which you can play now. You can grab your disc cart, put it in your 3DS, and you can play it straight away. It's not like sort of what it was getting to in Generation 3, where you had obviously the main reason they did it for Generation 3 is because Generation 3 was based on Hoenn, and there weren't many Kansei Pokemon really, or hardly any at all, so they had to do something to allow it, and obviously that was just a good option there. But imagine that goes along here, so we're looking at doing a Generation 5 remake, and if we look at the difference in years between that, so if that carried along, the Generation 3 remakes would be coming 10 years after the initial games, the Generation 4 remakes about 9 or 10 again from the initial games, and then the Generation 5 remakes would only be 8 years, or possibly 9 years if it was pushed further, away from the original release of their games, and that's a very short turnaround. As I've mentioned, you don't really need a remake for a Nova right now. You can play it very easily yourself as long as you own the game at home, and even then you can emulate it if you want, stuff like that. It's not needed, basically. So if we then look at the idea here, if we have Generation 5 as the skip generation, Generation 6 we have the remake of Ruby and Sapphire, Generation 7 again another skip generation, so we have in 2017 we have Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and if we assume Generation 8 possibly comes out in 2018 or more likely 2019, I feel like there's got to be a year gap somewhere, because they could easily keep churning them out. Actually, yeah, probably 2018. Okay, I was thinking 2019 at one point, because they like to have, don't like to churn them out every single year because people get pretty bored. But with the Switch, they might want to be looking at actually getting a game out for as soon as possible. You don't leave it to 2019, 2020, at which point the hype for the Switch will have mostly died off, and the console could be seen as a bit of a flop. Probably not the way it's going, but they want to get a main series Pokemon game on there as soon as possible, really. So more likely 2019, or 2018 rather, so looking at next December, next November sort of time, that a Switch main series game would happen for Generation 8, unless of course they decide to do like a year where they do Switch games that already exist, so maybe Sun and Moon remake, or a special version based in Alola on the Switch, as we've spoken about before. But assuming Generation 8 is then 2018 time, you then get a Generation 4 remake in 2019 or 2020, depending on how quickly the turnaround was. And that is 14 years after the original release of the games, as opposed to the 9 it would have been if it was back in Generation 6. And that's a big stark difference, because then if you keep extending that gap, so if we assume then Generation 9 comes along with just normal games, no remakes there, that's about another probably 3 years, we'll say, from 2020, so 2023. Generation 10 rather comes out in 2024, let's say, and then you get your remake for Generation 5 in 2025, let's say. It's very far in the future, I know, but if it was in 2025, that's 15 years after the original Generation 5 games came out, and obviously at that point you could be on the Switch still, maybe. If we look at the 3DS gens, we have 6 and 7, so yes, 8 and 9 probably going to be on the Switch. 10, depending on how long the Switch hangs around, could still be on the Switch as well, or it could have moved somewhere else entirely, at which point you probably would need Generation 5 remakes, because of the fact that you don't need them, but probably would want them, because the DS would have died off in 8 years time. We'll probably still have them around, but you won't be able to rely on the casual consumer to just have one sitting around and be able to whack it out and play black and white. So that's the thought process there behind the timeline. I've spoken a lot about that, a lot of information there, but one other thing that really backs this up is because of all of the data mining that's been done with the games of Sun and Moon particularly, we have some extra behind the scenes info, I suppose you could say. So basically every Pokemon game is given an ID. That makes a lot of sense, because you need to be able to distinguish, when you go on Pokemon Sun and it then communicates to Pokemon Moon, it needs to know which game it's communicating with, because when Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon come out with, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon need to know that Sun and Moon are lower versions or previous versions, and they can't trade like an Ultra Soul Galera across. That wouldn't make any sense. Just keep track of it, obviously, and then other stuff like the game it's caught in, where it originates from. So obviously when you bring up a Pokemon from Generation 6 into Sun and Moon, it doesn't have that clover, it's got, it hasn't got a pentagon or not at all, so something like that. So because of the fact that you need to know mainly which generation it's from, for purposes of online battling, of course. In Sun and Moon you can't use Pokemon that were caught in Generation 6. In Generation 7 they don't have a clover, so each game ID is then, you're then told, okay, this is assigned to this generation, or this area, so Pentagon or Clover basically for Generation 6 or 7, and they have a sort of an allotted amount, I suppose you could say, for each of those. So obviously I think we looked at it when, maybe I might be wrong, but maybe back in Generation 6 we looked at it and we saw that there were 4 slots for the Pentagon, so obviously X and Y and Auras, nothing more than that. And similarly there are only 4 slots for the Clover. So that means that Generation 7 possibly will only be Sun, Moon, Ultra Moon, because those are the 4 slots taken out. They might be wrong, because they could possibly send out a quick software update. However, looking at it, then we've always said, why can't you just release an update for X and Y to make them compatible with Auras and have primal reversions and all that stuff there? The reason is you cannot guarantee that everyone is running the latest software, latest update of the game, because someone might just not be using Wi-Fi. They might have bought the game in a store, running the original version and never updated. What happens when an Auras copy tries to communicate with that version? It might have, you'd hope it would have something built in to say, I can't recognise this game, I'm not going to connect to it, but ideally you would want it to have some level of knowledge to say you can't trade with it, etc. It says Pokemon Omega Ruby, etc. You can't trade with it. So you cannot guarantee that the games will always have the latest update, hence why you have this pre-allotted 4 Clover set slots, and then obviously, so each game there's if it's ID 1, it's Pokemon Sun. If it's ID 2, it's Pokemon Moon. If it's ID 3, it's this other game, which obviously they might not necessarily need to know what game it is, just that it's a game I can communicate with. So ID 4 is Ultra Moon, for example. So that's the reason there. And similarly, there's also, you have the Game Boy icon for any Pokemon transferred up from the Virtual Console versions of Red, Blue, etc. There are 7 slots for those. Similarly, so we have Red, Blue, Yellow. I'm trying to remember what else got released on the Virtual Console in terms of that. Obviously we have Gold and Silver coming, and I'm guessing is there a green? I don't know if is there a green? I can't remember off the top of my head if they released green on the Virtual Console, but there's 7 there similarly, and of course there's a Go icon, and we were, I think, told at some point that Go would be able to communicate with the latest games. Whether that's going to happen or not, I don't know, but they made sort of, they accounted for it when it first came along, and of course whether in the end that comes to be, who knows, etc. But that's where we are. So if there's only 4 slots for Generation 7, And we have Sun and Moon already, that's 2 slots there. And we have Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, that's another 2 slots. There's really no extra room for Generation 7. They could go ahead and release another game as well as part of Generation 7, but it would, one, be weird since it's not accounted for, and they generally have stuff planned out in advance. That's what I'm thinking of. And of course, as I mentioned with the timeline, they might have said a few years ago back at Generation 5, we can't keep doing these remakes year after year. It's not going to add up. We're going to have, Generation 5 remakes when we're on Generation 7. That doesn't make any sense. It's only 2 gens ahead. So of course they might have planned it in advance rather, in ahead again. Then said, right, we'll do this and this and this. We're going to have these many games for this generation, etc. And had pre-planning, which you would assume they would because it's a big company and whatnot, big series as well. And that's the idea behind that. So it's possible, but it seems unlikely, and I would think that we won't be seeing a Diamond and Pearl remake until possibly Generation 8. But that's my thoughts, that's what I've gathered from my investigations. Let me know what you think down below in the comment section. Do you think that, there's a possibility we might get a Diamond and Pearl remake tacked on after Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon to finish up Generation 7? Or do you think that at this point, Ultra Moon, Sun and Moon is enough for Generation 7 and they're going to wait till Generation 8 is in full flow to give us that Generation 4 remake? Let me know what you think down below in the comment section, guys, but it's going to be it for me for today, so I shall see you next time. I'm sorry for talking for so long, but this is it for me today. Goodbye, my friends.